Hello friends, welcome to my Heartbreak Stories channel. I invite you to join me on a walk through the city during the Fires Festival and listen to a new and interesting story. Let's go.
People often ask, how does a marriage fall apart? Not all at once. It happens slowly, in the small moments when one person stops investing and the other keeps building anyway. Today's story is about a man who saw the warning signs, said nothing, and spent 3 years preparing for the day his wife decided to make their divorce a public performance. What she couldn't have imagined was that the quiet man across that dinner table had already thought of everything. Now let's listen.
She announced our divorce on camera at our anniversary dinner. I handed her the keys and said, "Good luck tomorrow." She laughed. Next morning, accounts locked, cards dead, studio gone. She ran to the bank. The manager wouldn't even look at her. Then the door opened. She stopped laughing. "My name is Colin Braddock. I'm 47 years old. I'm the regional director for a mid-size insurance company out of Nashville, Tennessee. I've spent the last 22 years building something, a career, a home, a life that I thought we were building together. Portia and I met when I was 25 and she was 23. She was sharp, funny, ambitious in a way that felt electric back then. We got married 2 years later. No kids. That was a mutual decision we made early on, and I never regretted it. What I do regret is mistaking her ambition for loyalty. Portia ran a home decor consulting business, or what she called a business. In reality, it was an Instagram page with a ring light and a schedule full of client appointments that somehow always ended at wine bars. She built a following. Tens of thousands of people watching her rearrange, throw pillows, and call a lifestyle brand. I supported it. Fully. I paid the bills, funded the studio space she rented downtown, and smiled in the background of her grateful heart, grounded life posts whenever she needed a human prop. Spencer came into the picture about 2 years ago. He was her business development consultant. That's what she called him. I called him a guy with a leased BMW and a LinkedIn profile full of buzzwords and no actual company behind any of them. What I didn't know then, what I'd find out much later, was that Spencer's finances were a house of cards. But Portia didn't know that either. She thought she was upgrading. I need to be straight with you. I wasn't a perfect husband. I worked long hours. I traveled for client meetings in Memphis, Atlanta, Charlotte. I came home tired more often than not. But I was present when it mattered, or at least I thought I was. Looking back, I think I confused paying for a life with building one. That's on me. What I didn't do, and what she did, was go looking for the exit while still cashing the paychecks. The night it all went sideways started like 100 other nights. Portia had suggested we go to Hargrove's, a place downtown, white tablecloths, dim lighting, the kind of restaurant where the menu has no prices and the portions look like modern art. She said she wanted to celebrate our 20-year wedding anniversary. I booked the table. I bought her a bracelet, emerald-cut diamonds on a gold band. I even wore the gray suit she always said made me look like I had my life together. We were 40 minutes into dinner when she set down her fork and reached for her phone. I thought she was checking the time. Instead, she propped it against the water glass, tapped the camera, and smiled at the lens. "What are you doing?" I asked, watching the little red recording light blink. She tilted her head, amused, just capturing the moment. We kept talking. The food was good. The wine was poured. And then, maybe 20 minutes later, she lifted her glass toward mine and set it. Casual. Conversational. Like she was ordering dessert. "Cheers," Portia said, eyes steady on mine. "We're divorcing. Already posted about it, actually." The words landed like a door slamming shut in a quiet house. I looked at her for a long moment. Her glass was still raised. The phone was still recording. A couple at the next table had gone quiet. I could feel it without looking. She wanted an audience. She'd built her whole identity around having one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for my own glass. I set my napkin on the table, reached into my jacket pocket, and pulled out the house keys. The full set, both copies. I placed them next to her bread plate, like I was leaving a tip. "Good luck tomorrow," I said quietly. Her smile flickered for just a second. "What does that mean?" I didn't answer. I stood up, tucked in my chair, left $400 on the table, and walked out through the front door into the cool Nashville night. Behind me, I heard her laugh, sharp, performative, meant for the camera. She thought it was a victory lap. She had no idea it was the starting gun. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was broken up about it. I'd had 3 years to process what was coming. I didn't sleep because I was running through the checklist one last time. Every transfer, every filing, every signature. Walter had drilled it into me. The difference between a good plan and a great one is the third review. So I sat in the kitchen of my rental apartment, the place I'd quietly moved half my personal belongings into 8 months earlier, and I went through the binder page by page until the sky outside turned gray. By 6:30 in the morning, I poured a coffee and sat back. Everything was in order. It had been in order for a long time. Now it was just a matter of watching the dominoes fall. Portia, I knew, would wake up to a different kind of morning. She had posted the video before I even reached my car the night before. I know because Dana texted me at 11:15, her sister, for years younger, the one person in that family with both a conscience and a backbone. Her message was short. She just went live. Announced it to 3,000 people. You okay? I typed back, better than okay. Watch what happens tomorrow. What happened was this. Portia woke up to a flood of comments, hundreds of them, telling her she was brave and bold and a queen reclaiming her throne. She soaked it in. She was already drafting a follow-up post, already building the next chapter of her public persona. The liberated woman shedding the boring insurance man who never understood her vision. Then her phone stopped working. Not a dead battery. Not a drop signal. The device simply locked her out. Remote access revoked. Carrier account restructured under the corporate plan I'd quietly shifted 3 months prior. She would have tapped it, restarted it, stared at the Apple logo cycling over and over. Then she'd have gone to her laptop. The joint account she used for her studio expenses, her spa appointments, her wardrobe hauls. Invalid password. She'd have tried to reset. Access denied. She'd have called the bank. Voice already sharp before anyone picked up. I imagine the customer service rep's pause when she gave her name. The careful, measured response. Ma'am, you were removed from that account yesterday at 4:51 p.m. Access has been revoked by the primary account holder. I wasn't there to see her face, but I've known Portia for 22 years. I know exactly what that silence sounded like. What she didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to find out in all the years she called my work just insurance stuff, was that 18 months ago, I had quietly launched a second venture underneath my professional role. A holding company, Aldercroft Management, LLC. Walter had helped me structure it cleanly across 2 states, with its own governance documents, its own advisory board, its own paper trail that stretched back further than our marriage had been unraveling. Every significant asset we had, the house, both vehicles, the downtown studio she operated out of, had been transferred into Aldercroft under retained usage agreements. Her name appeared on none of the deeds. She had signed off on the restructuring herself, twice, through routine DocuSign requests I'd sent during moments I knew she'd be distracted. She thought those emails were tax efficiency updates. She clicked approve without reading a single line. There was one more thing she discovered that morning, something I hadn't even planned, but which landed harder than anything I'd arranged. Her laptop search history showed she'd spent 40 minutes trying to access a credit application she'd submitted 6 months earlier. She had attempted to open a personal line of credit using my financial profile as a co-applicant, without telling me, without my signature, using an old power of attorney document from a real estate deal we'd done years back. The application had been automatically denied. Every asset she tried to list as collateral was already titled under Aldercroft. The bank system had flagged the attempt and forwarded a courtesy notice to my attorney. I found out about it that morning when my lawyer, Greg, called at 8 a.m. She tried to use you as a financial backstop 6 months ago, he said without preamble. I wasn't even surprised. I just told him to add it to the file. By mid-morning, Portia had launched a new post. She called it her Journey to Freedom series, a paid subscription, $9.99 a month, promising followers a raw and honest account of her path through divorce. She had it live within 4 hours of losing access to our accounts. She was already monetizing the wreckage. My attorney flagged it by noon. Every video she'd ever posted had been filmed in our house, using equipment I'd purchased, in a studio space held under a lease agreement controlled by Aldercroft. Her brand, her content, her entire platform. It had been built on assets that were no longer in any way connected to her name. Greg sent her legal team a formal notice before the business day was out. I sat in my kitchen, finished my second coffee, and looked out the window at the Nashville skyline. She thought she was writing the story. She didn't realize I'd already copyrighted the setting. I was already inside the bank when Portia arrived. That was intentional. Walter had suggested it the week before, sitting across from me in his study with a cup of black coffee and the particular stillness of a man who had spent 30 years watching people unravel in courtrooms. "Be there first," he said. "Let her make the entrance. You make the exit." Charles Denton met me at the side entrance at 9:15. He was precise about time, always had been in the 12 years I'd worked with this branch. We shook hands, walked to his office, and I signed 3 sets of transfer documentation while his assistant prepared the formal account restructuring summary. Charles didn't say much. He didn't need to. He knew the situation. He knew me. And if there was a particular care in how thoroughly he followed procedure that morning, I didn't ask about it. I'd heard from Dana that Portia had once filmed a short clip in this branch's lobby, something sarcastic about old-fashioned banking, and tagged the location. Charles had seen it. He mentioned it to me once, briefly, about a year ago, in the neutral tone of a man filing away information for later. That was the only time it came up between us. At 9:47, I heard her voice in the lobby. She hadn't changed her approach from the day before, still the same performative volume, the same expectation that the room would reorganize itself around her presence. I caught fragments through the glass partition. "I need to speak to the manager. He knows who I am. This is completely unacceptable." Charles excused himself with a small nod and went out to meet her. I stayed where I was. I heard the conversation in pieces. His voice, measured, courteous, unmovable. Hers, cycling through indignation towards something that sounded increasingly like the beginning of real fear. He told her the accounts were under the authority of the primary signatory of the holding entity. She told him she was the man's wife. He told her that was no longer a qualifying status under the current structure. She demanded he call me. That was my cue. I buttoned my jacket, picked up the leather portfolio Walter had helped me put together, 2 years of documentation in one clean, organized package, and walked out of the office into the lobby. The room didn't stop. That's not how real life works. Tellers kept typing. A customer near the mortgage desk looked up briefly. But Portia stopped. She turned toward the door when she heard it open, and the moment she saw me, something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, more like the sudden vertigo of a person who realizes the floor is lower than they thought. I wasn't the man she'd left in that restaurant. I was wearing the charcoal suit I kept for regulatory meetings. No wedding ring. Walter stood just behind me, and to the left, 71 years old, silver-haired, with the quiet authority of someone who had once decided the fates of courtrooms. His presence alone changed the temperature of the room. "What is going on?" Portia demanded. Her voice dropped now, stripped of its audience quality. "Who is he?" "Walter Farrell," I said. "My attorney and advisor. He helped me structure the holding entity your accounts were attached to. You may have some questions for him." She turned to Walter. He looked back at her with the patient expression of a man who had seen exactly this moment 100 times before and was neither moved nor surprised by it. Charles stepped forward with the documentation. I signed where indicated. The transfers were confirmed. The account restructuring was complete. It had been complete for 48 hours, technically, but this was the formal close.
I have to stop here for a second. She walked into that bank ready to fight, ready to demand, ready to win, and instead she found him already there, calm, prepared, with the retired judge standing beside him, not angry, not emotional, just done. That's not revenge. That's consequence. And there's a big difference between the two.
Portia took a step toward me. "Colin, you need to explain this to me right now." I looked at her steadily. "I told you last night. Good luck tomorrow." I paused, then added, "It's tomorrow now." Her jaw tightened. She looked at Walter, then at Charles, then back at me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, Portia had no camera, no caption, no curated response ready. Just her, in a bank lobby, surrounded by people who were following a procedure she hadn't known existed. Walter touched my arm lightly, the signal we'd agreed on. We had another meeting in 40 minutes. I picked up my portfolio, nodded to Charles, and walked toward the exit. Portia called my name once. I didn't stop. I pushed through the glass door into the Nashville morning and kept walking. Behind me, the door eased shut on its hydraulic hinge. Quiet. Final. Exactly as planned. The night after the bank, I drove back to the rental and spread everything out on the kitchen table. Not because I needed to review it, I had it memorized, but because I wanted to see it laid out in front of me one more time. 22 years of a life, distilled into 43 pages of documentation. Walter had been the one to push me toward this 3 years ago. We'd been having dinner at his house. He and I went back further than most people knew, college acquaintances who reconnected when I started climbing in the insurance world and needed someone who understood both law and discretion. He poured a second glass of wine, leaned back in his chair, and said something I wrote down the next morning. A man who builds quietly is a man who keeps what he builds. I started listening more carefully after that. Aldercroft Management LLC had been registered 18 months before that restaurant dinner. Incorporated in Tennessee, with a secondary filing in Georgia, governed by a 12-page operating agreement that Walter had drafted and revised 3 times before we were both satisfied. The advisory board had 2 names on it besides mine, both longtime colleagues from the insurance industry, both aware of the structure, neither connected to anything in my personal life. I transferred the house first. It was the cleanest move, a straightforward title transfer to the LLC under a retained usage agreement that allowed Portia and me to continue living there as occupants. She had never asked why the mortgage correspondence started coming addressed differently. I told her once, casually, that I was restructuring for tax purposes. She nodded and went back to whatever she was editing on her laptop. The studio lease came next. I negotiated the renewal directly with the property management company and had the new agreement drawn up under Aldercroft. Portia signed the occupancy addendum herself, a single-page document I sent her on a Thursday afternoon while she was at a lunch meeting. She initialed 3 lines and texted me. Done. Was this necessary? I replied, just keeping things clean on her end. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji and didn't mention it again. The vehicles followed the same pattern. Both titles quietly refiled. Both insurance policies restructured under the corporate umbrella. All of it documented, all of it legal, all of it completely invisible to someone who had decided years ago that the business side of our life was my department. What I found that morning, forwarded by Greg from the bank's compliance desk, was the credit application. 6 months ago, Portia had submitted a request for a $180,000 personal line of credit, listing our home and her studio as collateral, using an old limited power of attorney document from a 2019 real estate transaction. The application had been auto-denied within 24 hours. Every asset she'd listed was already titled under Aldercroft. The bank system had flagged the attempt and generated a compliance notification. I sat at the kitchen table and read through the application twice. She hadn't told me, hadn't asked, had simply reached for something that wasn't hers to reach for and assumed the structure would hold her weight. That told me everything I needed to know about how she'd been thinking about our marriage for at least the past year and a half. I called Greg and told him to add it to the filing. Then I called Dana. Portia's sister picked up on the second ring. She sounded tired, the kind of tired that builds up when you've been watching a slow-motion disaster from the front row. She called me this morning, Dana said without any preamble. After the bank. She was furious. Said you ambushed her. I gave her the keys and said good luck. I replied evenly. That was the whole ambush. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, she said, Colin, there's something I should have told you sooner. About a year ago, I saw some messages on her phone by accident. Between her and Spencer. I didn't read much. I didn't want to, but I saw enough. She exhaled. I should have said something then. I'm sorry I didn't. I let that sit for a few seconds. Dana, you didn't do anything wrong. She's my sister, she said. But what she did to you wasn't right. And I think she's been planning this longer than you know. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a long time. Outside, Nashville was doing what Nashville does in the fall. Gray skies, cold edge on the wind, leaves skittering across the parking lot below. I thought about what Dana had said, about how long this had been in motion. Then I thought about Aldercroft, about the 43 pages on my table, about Walter's voice saying a man who builds quietly is a man who keeps what he builds. I stacked the papers neatly, put them back in the portfolio, and made a fresh pot of coffee. She'd been planning her exit for over a year. I've been planning mine for 3. Greg called me at 8:15 on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the bank. Her attorney just contacted my office, he said. A man named Nolan Price. He wants to schedule a preliminary settlement discussion. What's his tone? Aggressive on paper, nervous underneath it. Greg paused. He's already found the post-marital agreement. I poured my coffee and sat down. How'd he take it? About how you'd expect. He's calling it procedurally irregular. He'll challenge it. He won't get far. The post-marital agreement had been drafted 2 years ago, reviewed 3 times by 2 separate attorneys, notarized, and executed through a certified DocuSign session. Portia had signed it on a Saturday afternoon 2 years back. I'd sent it while she was at a brand strategy retreat in Gatlinburg. Under the subject line, Updated Household Financial Structure, signature required by Friday. She'd signed it in 11 minutes. The session log showed she'd opened the document at 2:47 p.m. and completed her signature at 2:58. 11 minutes for 22 pages. She hadn't read a single one. The agreement was clean and unambiguous. In the event of separation or divorce, any property titled under a corporate or trust entity would remain the sole legal asset of the designated holder. Community property assumptions were explicitly waived. There was a clause, Supplementary Section D, that addressed what it called demonstrative reputational conduct. In plain language, if either party publicly ridiculed, monetized, or broadcast the dissolution of the marriage in a manner damaging to the other party's professional reputation, all asset transfers were subject to immediate review and potential reallocation by the controlling entity. Portia had triggered at the moment she propped her phone against a water glass in Hargrove's and hit record. I knew Nolan Price slightly by reputation, a Nashville family law attorney with a good win rate in standard proceedings and no particular experience with corporate asset structures. He was about to learn that this wasn't a standard proceeding. What I hadn't anticipated was the phone call I got 2 hours after Greg's update. It came from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Mr. Braddock. The voice was male, careful. My name is Ellis Ward. I'm a licensed private investigator. I was retained by your wife approximately 6 weeks ago to conduct a financial background investigation on you. I set down my coffee cup. Go ahead. A pause. I think you should know that we have a mutual acquaintance. Walter Farrell and I worked together on a case about 8 years back. When your name came up in my client intake, I made a call. Another pause. I want you to know that every report I've generated has been forwarded to Walter's office rather than to Mrs. Braddock. I absorbed that for a moment. She paid you to investigate me. She did. 6 weeks of work. I billed her for all of it. His tone carried the faint satisfaction of a man who had done something he considered correct. She's been trying to locate hidden assets, specifically anything outside the Aldercroft structure. There's nothing to find, of course, but she doesn't know that yet. What has she told you about her plans? Enough, Ellis said. She's been discussing her situation with a group of friends. One of them, a woman named Petra, has apparently been encouraging her to go public with accusations of financial control and manipulation. There's talk of a media interview. I thanked him, ended the call, and immediately dialed Greg. 40 minutes later, I was sitting across from Walter in his study. I relayed both conversations. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on his desk, his expression exactly the same as it always was, attentive, unsurprised, calculating. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She hired a man to find your vulnerabilities, and he called you instead. That tells you something about the quality of her judgment." "It tells me she's scared," I said. "Scared people make noise." Walter leaned forward slightly. "Let her make noise. Every public statement she makes goes into the file. Every accusation, every post, every interview she gives, all of it subject to Supplementary Section D." He paused. "What she doesn't understand is that the louder she gets, the less she ends up with." I drove back to the rental in the early afternoon. On the way, I passed the studio building downtown, the one Portia had called her creative sanctuary, the one she'd featured in 47 separate posts over 3 years. The lights were still on inside. She was still operating as if the ground hadn't moved. That was her pattern. Project Confidence until reality caught up. Reality, in my experience, always caught up. Dana showed up at my door on a Sunday evening without calling ahead. She had a paper coffee cup in each hand and the expression of someone who had been rehearsing what they wanted to say for longer than the drive over. I let her in. We sat at the kitchen table. She put one of the cups in front of me and wrapped both hands around hers and looked at the table for a moment before she spoke. "I need to tell you everything," she said. "Not just the part one mentioned on the phone." I waited. She looked up. "About 18 months ago, I was at Portia's studio helping her set up for a client event. She stepped out to take a call and left her laptop open on the work table. I wasn't snooping. The screen was just there. But I saw the messages. She described them carefully, not word for word, but enough. Spencer's name. The dates going back further than I'd realized. References to timelines, to planning, to conversations about what Portia would need before she could move. Dana had stood there for maybe 30 seconds before stepping away from the screen. Then she closed the laptop and waited for her sister to come back inside. I confronted her that same week. Dana continued. Just the two of us. I told her what I'd seen. She denied it for about 5 minutes, and then she stopped denying it and told me it was complicated and that I didn't understand her marriage. Dana's jaw tightened. She asked me to stay out of it. And you did, I said. Not as an accusation, just a fact. For about a month. Dana reached in her coat pocket and set her phone on the table. She turned it face up and slid it toward me. On the screen was a forwarded email thread, her address in the send field, my personal email in the recipient line, dated 16 months ago. I sent you the screenshots. I didn't know if you'd seen them or what you'd do with them. I thought if you had them, at least you'd have the choice. I had seen them. I remembered the exact moment, sitting in my office with the door closed, reading through each one twice. It was the conversation with Walter that same evening that had accelerated the Aldercroft timeline. You gave me 14 months, I said quietly. Dana nodded. She looked tired in the way people look when they've been carrying something heavier than they let on. She figured out eventually that the screenshots came from me. She called me 3 days after the restaurant. Her voice flattened. She said I betrayed her, that I'd chosen a man over my own sister. I started to say something, but Dana held up a hand. I told her the truth, she said evenly. I told her I hadn't chosen you over her. I'd chosen honesty over her dishonesty. Those are different things. She picked up her coffee cup. She hung up on me. We sat quietly for a moment. Outside the window, the Nashville evening had gone fully dark. She's going to try to discredit you, I told her. Her attorney may bring up the screenshots and argue they were obtained improperly. Dana nodded. Walter already called me. We talked for 40 minutes. I'm prepared. That caught me slightly off guard. Not that Walter had called, but the quiet readiness in her voice. She wasn't scared. She decided which side of this she stood on, and she was standing there without flinching. One more thing, Dana added, almost as an afterthought. Spencer. I looked into him a bit after I saw those messages. Just publicly available stuff. His consulting firm has no registered business address. His LinkedIn lists 3 companies that don't appear in any state registry. She met my eyes. Whatever Portia thought she was getting with him, it isn't what she thinks it is. I already knew about Spencer's finances. Ellis had included a summary in the materials forwarded to Walter. But hearing it from Dana, watching her say it with the quiet resignation of someone who'd hoped her sister had made a better choice, made it land differently. Thank you, Dana, I said, for all of it. She stood, picked up her cup, and shrugged in the way people do when they want to deflect sincerity. Just don't make me regret it. She didn't say it like a warning. She said it like a woman who already knew she wouldn't. Spencer Alcott's financial profile arrived in my inbox on a Monday morning. 8 pages, compiled by Ellis, clean and sourced entirely from public records. I read it at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the particular calm of a man confirming something he'd already suspected. Spencer's consulting firm, Alcott Strategic Partners, had been registered in Tennessee 3 years ago with a listed address that turned out to be a UPS store on Charlotte Pike. No employees, no verifiable clients, no business filings beyond the initial registration. His LinkedIn profile listed 2 previous firms, both dissolved, one of which had a judgment against it for unpaid vendor contracts totaling $62,000. He drove a leased BMW. His apartment was a month-to-month rental in a building that catered to short-term stays. The man Portia had chosen as her upgrade was running a shell of a professional life on borrowed time and borrowed money. He had been, in all likelihood, watching our household for what he could attach himself to. When Portia lost access to every asset she thought she controlled, Spencer's interest evaporated with the same speed. Dana confirmed it 3 days later with a single text. He's gone. Blocked her on everything. She found out through a mutual contact. I set the phone down and didn't feel anything in particular about it. I'd stopped feeling things about Spencer somewhere around the 14th month of building Aldercroft. What I did feel, and what I want to be straight about was a quiet kind of accountability. I've turned this over in my head enough times to be honest about it. I wasn't a bad husband in the ways that make for easy villains. I didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't disappear. But I worked in a way that treated our marriage like a stable contract rather than something that needed tending. I came home with results, a good house, solid finances, a life that functioned, and I confuse function with connection. That's on me. It doesn't excuse what Portia did. But it's the part of the story I own. I told Walter as much, sitting in his study that same week. He looked at me for a moment before responding. A man who can say that without collapsing into self-pity, he said, is a man who's going to be all right. We moved on to practical matters. Greg had filed responses to Nolan Price's preliminary motions. Every challenge to the post-marital agreement had been met with documented evidence, the DocuSign session log, the attorney countersignatures, the notary records. Price's strongest argument was that Portia hadn't been given adequate time to review. Greg's response was simple. She'd been given 14 days' notice by email before the signing window opened. The document had been available for review the entire time. That she'd chosen to sign it in 11 minutes on a Saturday afternoon at a retreat was her decision, not a procedural irregularity. The Journey to Freedom subscription series had generated $430 in its first week before YouTube froze the monetization pending the licensing dispute. Portia's attorney had received the copyright and licensing notice from Aldercroft the same morning. Nolan Price had called Greg twice about it. Greg had been polite and unhelpful both times. What hit Portia hardest, and I learned this from Ellis, who was still receiving her calls, was not the money. It was the narrative. She had constructed an identity around this divorce. The liberated woman, the one who walked away. Now the comments on her posts were shifting. People were asking questions. The story was developing wrinkles she hadn't scripted. I didn't go public with anything. When people in my professional circle asked what was happening, and some of them did, carefully, over coffee or in hallway conversations, I gave the same answer every time. It's being handled. Nothing more. No performance. No victim story. No carefully edited version of events designed to win sympathy. I had been asked twice to give a brief comment to a local business publication that was picking up on the Aldercroft licensing dispute. I declined both times. Walter had said it best, weeks earlier, you don't measure intelligence by how loud someone is. I wasn't loud. I was done. The formal revocation notice for the studio occupancy license arrived by courier on a Wednesday afternoon. A single envelope delivered to the building's management office, addressed to Portia Braddock, marked legal notice. Occupancy license revocation, Aldercroft Management LLC. I knew it had been delivered because the building manager called me, not Portia, to confirm receipt, as the operational instructions required. I thanked him, made a note of the time and date, and forwarded the confirmation to Greg. Portia had 15 days to vacate the studio premises. Everything inside, the furniture, the lighting rigs, the camera equipment she'd purchased through her joint account, the decorative inventory she used for client staging, all of it had been cataloged by Aldercroft's property management contractor 3 weeks earlier. Items purchased with joint funds were listed as potential assets subject to the ongoing audit. Items she could demonstrate were personally purchased with her own separate funds, of which there were very few, were hers to remove. She contested it, of course. Nolan Price sent a strongly worded letter to Greg's office arguing that the occupancy license revocation constituted economic harassment and violated Portia's right to operate her legitimate business. Greg's response was 4 paragraphs and 17 footnotes. The occupancy license was explicit. Aldercroft held the right to revoke with 15 days' notice upon breach of reputational conduct standards. The Journey to Freedom series, the public statements, the posts naming me in the context of financial abuse, all of it documented, all of it filed, all of it qualifying under the breach clause by the plain language of the agreement Portia had signed. Nolan Price did not file an injunction. He knew it wouldn't hold. What I hadn't expected, and what landed with more force than I'd anticipated, was the call from Portia herself. She didn't use her attorney. She called me directly, on a Thursday evening, from a number I didn't recognize. I picked up because I didn't know who it was. Her voice was different. Not the polished, performance-ready voice she used for her channel, and not the sharp, indignant voice she'd used at the bank. This was something underneath both of those, quieter, more ragged around the edges. "You're taking everything," she said. Not as an accusation this time. More like a statement she was still trying to understand. "I'm following the agreements," I replied evenly. "The ones you signed." A pause. "Colin, the studio is my livelihood." "It was your livelihood," I said. "It was operated on property controlled by a holding entity you signed off on. That's not something I can undo, and it's not something I'm going to." "Where am I supposed to go?" I kept my voice level. "That's a question you should have thought about before you propped a phone against a water glass and announced our divorce to 3,000 people." I paused. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and I think somewhere you already know it." She didn't respond to that. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then she said, very quietly, "Was there ever a point where I could have stopped this?" I thought about that honestly. "Probably not in the last 3 years," I said. "But maybe before that."
That question hit me hard. Was there ever a point where I could have stopped this? That's not anger anymore. That's someone finally understanding what they lost. And his answer, probably not in the last 3 years, but maybe before that, that's not cruelty. That's just the truth. Sometimes the saddest part of a story isn't the ending. It's realizing exactly when the ending became inevitable.
I didn't say anything else. She didn't either. The call ended without either of us hanging up dramatically. It just went quiet, and then it was over. I sat in the kitchen for a while after that. Not with satisfaction, not with grief. Just the particular stillness of a chapter closing on its own terms. The studio lights would go dark in 15 days. Nashville would keep moving. So would I. 3 weeks after the studio revocation, Nashville had its first hard frost of the season. I remember it because I was standing on the small balcony of my rental apartment at 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, watching the parking lot below go white and still. There was something clarifying about it. The way cold strips everything down to its essential shape. Greg called at 9 with an update on the settlement proceedings. Nolan Price had filed his final response to the post-marital agreement challenge. A family court judge had reviewed both submissions and ruled that the agreement was valid and enforceable. Community property claims were dismissed. The Aldercroft asset structure stood intact. Portia's share of the marital estate was limited to what she could demonstrate as personally acquired, which, after audit, amounted to her wardrobe, her personal vehicle purchased 4 years ago with an inheritance from her grandmother, and a savings account in her name alone containing $11,000. 22 years of marriage. $11,000 in a closet. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I want to be clear on that point. I felt the particular weight of something that had been necessary and was now done. The way you feel after a long, demanding project reaches its final filing. Not celebration. Resolution. Walter came by that afternoon. He sat in the one good armchair I'd brought from the house and accepted the coffee I poured him and looked out the window at the frost-pale street below. "You could have come out of this louder," he said after a while. "Not as a criticism, just an observation." "I know," I replied. "Some men would have." He turned the cup in his hands, posted their side of it, made sure people knew what she'd done, what she tried to do with that credit application, what Spencer turned out to be. He paused. "You didn't." "No," I agreed. He nodded slowly. "That's the part of this that mattered most. Not the structure, not the legal work, though those were sound. The part that mattered was that you didn't become what she wanted you to be. She needed you to be the bitter, vindictive husband. It would have made her narrative work." He set down his cup. "You refused to play the role." I thought about that for the rest of the day. The Journey to Freedom channel had gone quiet 2 weeks earlier. YouTube had not restored monetization following the Aldercroft licensing dispute. And without the income stream, and without the studio backdrop that had defined her brand aesthetic, Portia's content had dried up. Her follower count had dropped steadily as the silence extended. The comments on her last post, a vague caption about transition and growth, posted from what appeared to be her mother's living room, were a mix of confused loyalty and quiet abandonment. Spencer had not reappeared. Ellis confirmed he'd relocated to Atlanta, where he had apparently found a new consulting arrangement with a woman who ran an event planning company. I noted that detail and filed it away without any particular feeling attached to it. Dana called me that same week. She sounded lighter than she had in months. Still tired, but lighter. She reached out to me. Dana said, "Portia." She asked if we could talk. "What did you tell her?" I told her yes, but that I needed some time first. A pause. I'm not ready to pretend nothing happened. But she's still my sister. I'm not going to cut that off permanently over something she did to someone else. Another pause. Is that okay with you? Dana, I said, you don't need my permission for your own family. She laughed. The first real laugh I'd heard from her in a long time. I know. I just wanted you to hear from me first. I made my decision that same evening. I've been turning it over for weeks, the way you turn over a question that doesn't have a wrong answer, just a better one. I called a real estate contact in Knoxville, a man I'd worked with on a commercial property deal 2 years back, and told him I was looking for something with land. Quiet, not too far from the mountains. He called back the next morning with 3 options. I wasn't running. I want to be straight about that. Running is when you leave before you've finished what needed finishing. I was leaving after. That's a different thing entirely. I told Greg to proceed with the final divorce filing. I told Walter I'd have a forwarding address within a month. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a legal pad and wrote down, for the first time in years, a list of things I wanted, not things I needed to manage or protect or hold together. Things I actually wanted. It was a short list. That felt right. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late November. Greg handled the courthouse appearance. I wasn't required to be present. I was in my car driving east on I-40 toward Knoxville when my phone buzzed with his text. Done. Clean. Congratulations on the other side of it. I pulled over at a rest stop east of the city, got out, and stood in the cold air for a few minutes. The Smoky Mountains were just visible on the horizon, blue-gray, patient, enormous in the way that makes human complications feel appropriately small. I stood there long enough to let the moment be what it was. Then I got back in the car and kept driving. The property in Knoxville was 11 acres on the eastern edge of the city, a craftsman-style house set back from the road, mature oaks along the front boundary, a creek running along the southern edge of the land. I'd signed the purchase agreement 10 days earlier. The house was in my name, through Aldercroft, held cleanly, and simply with no complications attached. I'd spent the previous 2 weeks transferring my personal belongings from the rental in stages. Not much. I'd left behind more than I'd taken, which was intentional. The furniture in the Nashville house remained with the property, pending Aldercroft's disposition decisions. I took the things that were mine in the way that can't be documented on a deed, a set of tools my father had given me when I turned 30, 3 boxes of books, the leather portfolio Walter had helped me put together that first year of building Aldercroft, and the charcoal suit I'd worn to the bank, which I folded and put in the back of the closet of the new house and didn't plan to wear again for a long time. Portia's final public post went up the week after the divorce was finalized. It was carefully worded. Something about growth through difficulty, about learning who you are when circumstances strip away what you thought defined you. No mention of me by name. No mention of Spencer, who remained in Atlanta and remained silent. The comments were mostly supportive in the cautious way people support someone they've stopped fully believing. I didn't read past the first 3 lines. Not out of bitterness. There wasn't much of that left. Just because it wasn't my story anymore, and I had stopped needing to know how she was framing it. What I thought about on that drive east was something Walter had said during one of our last conversations before I left Nashville. We'd been sitting in his study. The same study where 3 years ago he'd said a man who builds quietly is a man who keeps what he builds. And he'd looked at me the way a man looks at someone he's watched go through something real and come out the other side still standing. You never went public, he said. Not once. Not a single statement. Not a comment. Not a reaction. In 20 years of watching how these things go, I can count on one hand the number of men who had that kind of discipline. I told him I hadn't felt disciplined. I just felt clear. He smiled at that. The rare, deliberate smile of a man who doesn't use them carelessly. That, he said, is what discipline feels like when it becomes second nature. 2 months after the move, I was standing on the back porch of the Knoxville house on a Sunday morning, coffee in hand, watching the creek move through the oaks at the bottom of the property. The water was low that time of year, moving quietly over the smooth stones, unhurried. Dana texted that morning. Just a photo of a hiking trail she'd found near her place in Franklin. No caption. I sent back a thumbs up. She sent a laughing emoji. That was enough. I thought about the list I'd made on the legal pad, the short one, the things I actually wanted. I checked off 2 of them already. There was time for the rest. The creek kept moving. The oaks stood where they'd been standing for decades. The mountains sat on the horizon, blue and steady, the same as they'd been the morning I drove east and the same as they'd be long after any of this mattered. I finished my coffee, went inside, and started the day.
So, Colin didn't shout, he didn't post anything online, he didn't try to win the argument in public, he just built something solid, waited, and let the truth do what the truth eventually always does. It showed up. And I think that's the part of this story that stays with me the most. Not the legal structure, not the documents, not the moment she froze in that bank lobby. It's the discipline, the decision to stay quiet when everything in you wants to react. That's harder than most people realize. I hope this story gave you something to think about today. If it did, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with me and with Colin's story. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.